So, hello everyone. This is Stephen Downs at eLearning 3.0 Central at my office at the National Research Council of Canada in Ottawa, Canada. And welcome to week one, actually our third week, but don't tell anyone, of eLearning 3.0. This week's topic is data, and we'll be looking at various aspects of data this week. But for right now, I want to introduce you to my guest, Shelly Blake-Plock from Yet Analytics, who has kindly consented to join us. I know he's very busy, so I really appreciate you, Shelly, taking the time out to visit us here today. We've already got viewers. Let me just see if the activity center is activating. Looks like it is, except it won't play in Internet Explorer, but we'll leave that aside. It looks like we're up and running. So, Shelly, welcome to the eLearning 3.0 course.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's our pleasure to have you. Might want to do a bit more volume on the microphone there. So a lot of people won't know about you and your company, Yet Analytics. So why not give us a short description of what the company is and what it does?
Sure. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So Yet Analytics works exclusively in the space of learning analytics. And we help folks in K-12 education, corporate learning and development, and military learning to use data in an actionable way to help understand learners, to help improve instruction and content, and really to help organize and manage data systems that support learning. So we are the folks who are really behind the scenes. If we're doing what we're supposed to, you probably won't see us. But we're making sure that all the data flows properly through the pipes and does what it's supposed to, both for people using it for insights and for other programs and machines to use the data to automate all kinds of processes.
So you led a fairly big study by the IEEE Learning Technology Subcommittee earlier this year on xAPI. xAPI, for those of you who are not familiar, stands for the Experience API. And it's a type of data that's used to track people as they go through their learning activities. What would you say the main takeaway from that study was?
It's interesting. I think that there are two things. So the Experience API, xAPI, was created to be a way to track learning experiences and performance in learning environments that was extensible beyond just traditional LMS and LMS launched content and activity. So the idea is that you can pull data from mobile applications, you can pull data from simulations and games, you can pull data from the physical world in terms of wearables and sensors and things like this. And early on, I think, in the development of xAPI, and I've been involved in it for about 5 years, early on, there was a lot of focus on the data model itself that was necessary to help machines and systems to communicate and pass this type of data around. Increasingly, we saw a need for not just a technical conversation, but a real conversation around the implementation. How do you implement these types of technologies in organizations. And so that's what the LTSC asked us to do. We put together a group of about 50 experts across the field, technical people, people in industry, end users, and wrote up a document that is sort of an implementation guide to xAPI. It deals with the data model itself and the protocols. It deals with the idea of how you can use that type of data for different purposes in analytics. It has to do with the implementation of the data model within systems and what that means in terms of building new software and new applications. And it deals with the whole issue of privacy and data governance, which obviously is really important when we're talking about tracking learner behaviors.
So, what would you say the reception to the report was? Because I know when it came out, I passed it along in my newsletter, but I didn't hear a whole lot of feedback. But what did you hear?
To me, there have been two interesting things. One is that report and the bringing together that community to write that report, I think, contributed very much to the IEEE taking seriously looking at standardizing xAPI, which is a data specification, standardizing it as an IEEE standard. So a subgroup that came out of that 50 people created a working group. It was approved through IEEE to create a standard out of this, and now we're working on that. And then the second thing is there is a companion specification to xAPI that was released about a year or a year and a half ago called xAPI Profiles. You can imagine that if you're dealing with what is semantic content, right, you're dealing with data where the data is sort of defined as words, that there can be a lot of tricky stuff, right? Am I shooting a clay pigeon or am I shooting a basketball? Very different thing, same word. Computers have difficulty understanding that. So Profiles was created to help create more standardized and structured vocabularies. And what we've seen is interest in sort of going through the same process, creating a technical report around xAPI Profiles implementation, and then moving that along into the standards process within IEEE. So I think the big takeaway is the fact that IEEE is actively working on this shows a maturity around the data specification.
So now the data that's collected, the xAPI statements themselves, which basically are reports of activities that people have undertaken in the course of their learning, these are stored in learning record stores, and that's what you guys provide. So who's using a learning record store? Why are they using it? What's the point of a learning record store?
Right. So there are three sort of key things that a learning record store does. One is the learning record store can be understood as sort of the server-side abstraction of the xAPI data specification. And what that really means in layman's terms is that it provides validation for any of the data that is attempting to go into that learning record store. So the learning record store is a data store, but it's a data store that has very strict and stringent standards into what's allowed into it. It's not just a Dropbox folder or a MySQL table. It has very specific standards. And if the data coming in doesn't meet those standards, it will reject that data. So one thing that the learning record store does is it provides the means to validate the confidence that you can have in all of the xAPI data passing through a learning ecosystem. Because if that data cannot pass into a conforming learning record store, it's not valid xAPI data. So it helps in terms of, it's a really great open source measure to know that we're dealing with valid data. The second thing is it stores that data, and it does so in an immutable format. So we are tracking activity over time, and that time and the type of activity that was done is stored in an immutable chronology, so that at any point in time, we could go back and recreate the activity and the processes that happened in a specific activity or experience. And then the third thing it does is it stores all of the data in a machine-readable format, which allows other data consumers, these are pieces of software, applications, machines, other databases, to be able to use that data in machine-driven ways defined by functions to produce all kinds of automated things, such as automated data visualizations or automated alerts and interventions about learner behavior, automated readouts about the way that content is or is not being used. So there's a lot of work being done in the industry around now, not just the ability to validate and store data, because we know how to do that, but now there's a lot of development being done, and now that we have it, what are all these things we can do with it? And that's sort of the world I live in.
Sure. Now, when you say that the record store ensures that the data complies with standards, you're talking about technical standards, formatting standards, as opposed to it has the right content or it's doing fact checking. It's not doing anything like that, right?
No, not at all. These are technical standards. There is a prescribed schema that the data is supposed to fit into, and the learning record store, its first job is to validate that the data coming in adheres to that specification.
And when you talk about immutable data storage, first thing that hits my mind, at least these days, when I hear something like that, is blockchain. How similar is an LRS to blockchain? And would you blockchainify? I don't know if that's a word. Would you blockchain LRS data? Would that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There are people in the space who are exploring that right now. Specifically, where I've seen the most interest has been in using blockchain to essentially help create a certifiable record of activity that specifically leads to competencies and credentials. And you could see where that could be really useful, because something like Ethereum is sort of its best use cases tend to be around contracts.
Right.
The idea of creating a smart contract. And you can understand like the achievement of a credential as a smart contract. I personally think that we're a ways off from that, but there are certain similarities in the way these things are used. Now, that said, not all immutable data needs to be a blockchain, and not all blockchain technologies need to be applied into something like that. But there definitely are people investigating in the space. It's pretty cool work.
Yeah, activity data can be success data, can it? It can record not just that you've done something, but that you've succeeded at doing something, right?
That's right. So when you create an xAPI profile, you're essentially creating an activity map for whatever domain you're going to be measuring. So if you're looking at something like frequency and type of engagement, I may want to limit the type of data that I'm going to look for to things around specific types of activity. For example, if I want to know not just that someone launched a video, but that I want to know how long they watched it. I want to know, did they pause it? Did they rewind? Did they share it with someone? Did they put it on a social media network? Those types of things can be useful to understand learner behavior. Likewise, if I'm looking for like more of a compliance-driven sort of thing, I might want to see that someone followed specific a specific pathway and achieve a specific result at the end. So there are different applications depending on need.
So this this raises, of course, a lot of issues, and a lot of them were discussed in this report, and of course, in all the conversation around it. Vahid Masroor, who's watching us, tweeted that this means that educators and education administrators will have to become increasingly familiar with data governance and privacy. I wonder if you can comment on that briefly.
Yeah, I think that. So there are two parts to my answer. The first part is that anyone who types a URL into their browser should be up to date on what's going on in data governance, just at a personal level. Because that's right, it is a major issue and a major decision point in not just something like xAPI, but just how we relate to any web-based technology. So that's just sort of off the top. Specific to any technology like this that's being used in the learning space, let's use an analogy. Like if you look at Facebook, which obviously has had its share of privacy and governance issues, the asset that Facebook holds is the activity stream of data of each individual user, which then it can aggregate and turn into something useful for trend recognition for advertisers to target advertisements. And that's how they make money. Mm-hmm. The entire space of event-based data and activity streaming data comes out of that sort of technological paradigm. And so that can be used for good, it can be used for evil. But everyone should recognize that that's what we're talking about. So if you're talking about something like creating a learner profile based on behavior and activity for the purpose of identifying competency or personalizing learning through automated means, you have to, as your start point, say, what is my appetite for and what is the stomach of my users around privacy and data. Because in order to do that technologically, you have to make certain trade-offs about privacy. And I would love to hear more of a conversation in the space about those trade-offs.
But you're hearing some conversation now, right? I know that, I looked at an IEEE publication on ethics in AI. And in fact, we just talked about that over the weekend here in some of the videos around the course. Are you guys involved in any of the data processing itself? I mean, like taking the data and analyzing the data to project trends, etc., like you just described?
So we have built sort of a commercial suite of technologies. Mm-hmm. The core technology that we put into the marketplace is a learning record store. That learning record store is available in different types of deployment. And that's what most people entering the space think about and what they understand. But the learning record store itself can be as simple as the application that validates the data and then stores the data. So long as it's doing that, it is a learning record store. So while in the marketplace, you'll see lots of different vendors talking about different analytics capabilities, different dashboards, different things like that, the learning record store itself doesn't require any of that stuff.
Right.
So in xAPI, the way we talk about it is you have a learning record provider, any data source that's providing information about the learner in xAPI format, or frankly, that can be coerced into xAPI format. We work with a lot of technologies that are not xAPI native, that we coerce using RESTful web methods. And then you have the data store itself, and then you have all these data consumers. We have built technologies across that whole suite. So some of the more interesting things that we're doing currently from my opinion, are things where we are using an xAPI profile that maps. Like this would be like in an enterprise commercial business user. It maps against certain business processes that they have in that organization, because what they want to do is they want to find alignment between their business processes and their learning processes.
Sure.
So we create an xAPI profile to align those things, and then we automate the analytics to produce, you can think of it as like mission control visualizations that are specific around those types of questions. So yeah, we do work in that space. And you're right to sort of disambiguate between sort of the storage side of things to the processing side of things. Over the past year, we did a lot of our work around privacy and GDPR. And that is a huge part of that entire set of requirements and protocols. But it's interesting because just the way that xAPI is described in that core specification really lays out those three types of technologies: inputs, storage, and consumers. I'm personally very interested in, and I think there's a lot of opportunity both for commercial firms and for academic projects to work on a lot of the middleware that exists in those things. We certainly get a lot of mileage out of that when we're working with the customer, because we have to build so many of the little parts in between. I would love to see a lot more sort of open source development there.
Yeah, me too. Speaking of which, now our course here is running on an application called Grasshopper. It's just it's a binder, twine, and masking tape kind of application. It's not a commercial thing at all. But if I was interested in exporting xAPI into, say, your LRS, how well, I was going to say, how easy is that? But nothing's easy. but can I do it? Can I just fire off xAPI statements into your LRS, or how would that work?
Sure.
And, this isn't just me. There's people out there doing courses all over the place, right? MOOCs and other kind of courses. How would they use this?
So depending on the application, there are a variety of launch mechanisms that are actually described in that report, which we can share a link to anyone on the call. It's an open Creative Commons report, came out of IEEE. And then secondly, so you could instrument the application itself. So you can instrument an application either close to the metal, or you can instrument the JavaScript to launch xAPI events.
Right.
Secondly, you can take a activity API. So, for example, we did one of these with Pivotal Tracker, the project management software. Pivotal Tracker has a nice sort of activity API. It says it internally tracks like when someone posts something, and when someone comments on something, or when someone sets up a new project. And we put a piece of middleware that ties into that API endpoint, translates that into the xAPI format, and then sends it to the LRS. So right. you can have this piece of middleware. None of it is particularly opaque. Some projects can be a bit more demanding than others, just having access to the endpoints that allow you to do it. But because REST API is such a sort of common thing, especially in commercial practice, there's been a lot of work done just around implementing in that way. Now, that said, there are folks who would suggest that you should use or could use like a piece of third-party software like If This Then That or xAPI or one of these sort of third-party integrators. I tend to suggest that people not do it that way, mostly because I don't like the idea of putting a third party between data sources. I think you should always be as close to your data source as possible for hot fixes and security purposes.
Yeah.
So we like to build as natively as possible. So that's just something that's out there that people, again, these are all trade-offs. It's software. But if you're familiar with sort of RESTful web methods, you would be comfortable instrumenting for xAPI.
Right. Would I have to set up my own LRS, or can I use yours? Or
Yeah,
this?
most LRSs now, there are varieties that you could download and run on your own servers, and they're completely hosted options. We have customers, typically who would do an AWS deployment, and mostly because one of the things to remember is that when you're dealing with activity data, you might be dealing with a lot more scale than you're used to,
Yeah.
because you're just tracking lots of information. So it can be useful to deploy on something like AWS or Azure, just because the scalability is built in.
So, what happens? And I'm sure this has come up on your side. So, I'm Joe Person out there. I use one application to learn here. I use another application to learn there. So, and they're sending off activity statements to LRSs, but they might send it to different LRSs. So now my activity data is distributed across different LRSs. Is there any way of rolling that up? How would you do that?
Let me make sure I understand the question. So we have a learner in one organization or one institution who is sending xAPI statements that are going into that institution's LRS. And then the question is, if that learner, say it's something like going from higher ed to a job. And so
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that becomes more of a policy question than a technology question. The technology makes it relatively facile because xAPI is made to be interoperable. You can always do a GET request, or you can use other methods to move information around from one place to the other, so long as it all remains in xAPI format.
Right.
The real question is a policy question, which is to what degree will a higher education institution and an employer work together to allow that to happen for a new recruit into an organization. And we see that in corporations, where there can also be issues around within a corporation, someone's training may be tied up in intellectual property and trade secrets and methods in the corporation. So there are a number of tricky policy issues to work out. On all of that stuff, I consider the technology to be easy, the policy to be difficult.
So yeah, we've run into scenarios like that. But I was thinking of something a little more basic. How do they know it's me on the two sets of activity records?
Oh, so that can be easy or it can be difficult. If it's easy, it's just because the xAPI statement requires some identifier, a unique identifier for the actor, that is the person who's doing something. Often, it's most common, we've seen, for people to use email addresses to do that. Obviously, the difficulty comes if, say, I have a school email address that I'm using for a course. I have a Gmail address that I'm using on my GitHub or whatever, and maybe I have a work email. I could have in other words, xAPI would naturally see you as three different unique identifiers. And there's nothing in xAPI that natively is going to link those three identifiers together. And I believe that was done on purpose to allow for different applications within the core constituency of xAPI as it was originally created, where you might not want one identification to be to another identification. And that's fine. What we see, particularly in larger scale deployments, is the entire issue of identity management. And this is a bigger issue related to activity data. So like in the sales and marketing space, they often talk about the issue of trying to understand the single view of the consumer. Right? Someone's they come to your web properties, they go to YouTube and see your advertisement, they get an email that you sent to them. How do you know it's all the same person? And it's been it's a big problem. It's difficult. It's not easy. But what we do in large-scale implementations is we actually establish the LRS as a downstream technology within an entire enterprise streaming architecture. And at the ingress point of that streaming architecture, we establish an identity management application. That identity management application uses both machine-driven algorithms, and it provides human administrators the ability to link people together, not just for the LRS, but for all of the data coming through the stream. So it tends to be a complex, very highly sophisticated solution. In my work, that's where I see that done. How it plays out at a smaller scale, I think is ripe for innovation to work there. Because I don't think at a smaller scale it's always either necessary or feasible to actually deploy like a Kafka implementation to run an entire data stream. So a lot of that's all ripe for innovation right now.
So just one final question, because kind of allocated our time here, but the question comes up about who owns LRS data. And of course, that's when you get the lawyers involved. But to take that in a slightly different direction, do you see the possibility anytime soon or ever of individual or personally owned LRSs? Do you see that activity data could ever be kept on a personal basis and then released on a permission basis or anything like that? How do you see the future of it?
It's interesting, and I think there are two things. Just at a practical perspective, there are policy issues that need to be laid out. We often see it in terms of application within corporations or applications within government, where people's contracts to their own data or whatever they produce tends to be part of their employment agreement.
Right.
I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, and a lot of modernization that can be done. Longer term, I would say this. I really believe not just in learning data, but I believe that we're entering a phase where experience is experience with a digital footprint is a form of media. And our activity increasingly online becomes media. Sometimes we do that ourselves, in the case of uploading things to YouTube. Sometimes it's done for us in the case of what happens behind the scenes to make sure that the internet applications work the way we want them to.
Right.
I think that there's a lot of potential and a lot of risk in that scenario, and I think it's gonna keep a lot of people up late at night, but hopefully well fed into the future.
Experience with the digital footprint is a form of media. Well, that's a pretty good note to close on. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this. This was an interesting discussion, generated good chat in the chat room, and I know people in the course appreciate it. So if people want to follow up with you on any of this, where would they contact you?
You can contact me directly at Shelly, SHELLY, at yetanalytics.com.
Great. Thank you very much. And to everybody watching the broadcast, we'll be closing it off now. And this will be available, of course, as one of the videos in the eLearning 3.0 videos page. And we'll be continuing our discussion of data through the rest of this week. Thanks a lot, Shelly.
Thank you.